Two of Utah's biggest off-road YouTube channels used to be inseparable. Joint recoveries, shared trail runs, constant cross-channel appearances. Paul Cox from Fab Rats and Matt Wetzel from Matt's Off-Road Recovery were practically brothers in the dirt. Their audiences overlapped, their families knew each other, and for years the collaboration felt effortless. Then, without a single public statement, a single call-out video, or even a public argument, it quietly stopped. No dramatic fallout, no heated comments, just silence. And that somehow makes it more interesting. Because when two channels this close drift apart without explanation, it usually means the story is messier behind the scenes than either side wants to admit. There are money disputes that never got resolved, directions that stopped making sense together, moments that changed the dynamic in ways nobody talked about on camera. And in this community, where the audience watches closely enough to notice when someone stops showing up, the questions don't go away just because nobody answers them. This is the story of how two guys who met at a demolition derby crashed into each other hard enough to start a lifelong friendship and built two of the most watched off-road channels in the country, eventually stopped appearing in each other's lives. What changed between the 2023 Record Games, where Paul stood on stage promising to come back stronger, and 2024, when Fab Rats didn't show up at all? The answer says a lot about what YouTube success does to the people chasing it. The story doesn't start with YouTube. It doesn't start with wrenches or wreckers or trail recoveries in the Utah desert. It starts at a demolition derby, with two guys who couldn't stand each other. Paul Cox and Matt Wetzel first crossed paths at a Washington County Fair competition, the kind of small-town event where local guys beat the hell out of beater cars for bragging rights and a trophy that means everything in that world. Paul competed hard. Matt competed harder. When the dust settled, Paul finished second, Ikonda behind Matt, and that was enough to keep a cold distance between them. Nobody threw punches, nobody made a scene, but in that world, second place stings, and the guy who beat you doesn't exactly become your best friend overnight. They kept running in the same circles though, because southern Utah is smaller than it looks on a map. Same events, same community, same type of people who'd rather spend a weekend destroying a car than sitting on a couch. And then came the moment that actually changed everything. At another derby, Paul hit Matt's car so hard he genuinely thought he'd seriously hurt him. Not a tap, not a glancing blow, the kind of crash that makes you hold your breath waiting to see if the other driver climbs out. Matt climbed out fine, and something about nearly taking each other out on a dirt track apparently broke whatever wall had been between them, because the two families became close after that. It's an origin story that fits them both. Neither Paul nor Matt built their audiences on polished content or carefully crafted personas. They built them on authenticity, the kind of rawness that comes from people who actually work with their hands, actually take risks, and don't particularly care about making things look cleaner than they are. Paul had spent over 2 decades as a telephone company lineman, away from home 4 or 5 days a week, before Fab Rats ever existed. Matt had spent years in roofing and towing before a camera ever pointed his way. These weren't guys who stumbled into YouTube looking for fame. They were already doing the work long before anyone was watching. That shared background is probably what made the friendship stick. When you've both come up the hard way, you recognize it in someone else pretty quickly. And for a long stretch, that recognition was the foundation of one of the most genuinely enjoyable collaborations in the off-road YouTube world. The question is, what eroded it? Paul launched Fab Rats in March 2020 out of his garage in Glendale, Utah, a small town in Kane County that most people drive through without stopping. He was still working full-time as a telephone company lineman when the channel started, grinding out content on his days off while Michelle handled the camera, the editing, and pretty much everything else behind the scenes. By his own admission, she told him everything he was doing wrong. By her own admission, someone had to. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't fast, but it was real. And that realness connected with people almost immediately. What made Fab Rats different from the start wasn't the builds themselves, impressive as they were. It was the atmosphere around them. Paul's garage wasn't a studio. It was an actual workspace where his kids wandered in, his friends showed up to help or get in the way, and his father Sherman, who passed away in late 2022, was a regular presence that gave the channel genuine emotional weight. Viewers weren't just watching someone fabricate metal. They were watching a family operate, argue, laugh, and figure things out together. That's a harder thing to manufacture than a good weld bead, and Paul never had to manufacture it. Matt's channel had a similar energy, just built around recovery instead of fabrication. Based out of Hurricane, Utah, MoRR grew from raw, unscripted documentation of actual tow jobs, the kind of content where the stakes were real because the situations were real. A Jeep hanging off a cliff isn't a prop. A stuck vehicle miles from the nearest road with daylight fading isn't staged drama. Matt's early audience grew because they were watching someone who genuinely knew what he was doing in situations most people never want to find themselves in. The competence was the entertainment. For a stretch that fans still talk about, the two channels fed each other naturally. Paul would show up on a recovery. Matt would swing through the Fab Rats shop. Joint trail runs, shared jobs, cross-channel shoutouts. The kind of collaboration that doesn't feel like a business arrangement because it isn't one. It's just two guys in the same corner of Utah who respect each other's work and happen to have cameras rolling. That era built something real in the off-road YouTube community, a sense that these channels weren't competitors. They were part of the same ecosystem, stronger together than apart. What nobody saw coming was how quickly that could change once the money got serious. If there was a single moment that represented everything the Fab Rats and MORR friendship had built, it was March 2023 at Sand Hollow State Park in Hurricane, Utah. The first ever off-road record games brought together the biggest names in Utah off-road YouTube and put them head-to-head in a competition nobody had tried at this scale before. Matt, Paul, Trailmater's Rory Irish, Merlin Johnson from Merlin's Old School Garage, and Eric from BSF Recovery, all lined up with their custom-built rigs, ready to drag, winch, climb, and grind through a course designed to break both machines and egos in front of a crowd that had traveled from across the country just to watch. The format was simple and brutal. Competitors had to locate, fix, and recover broken-down vehicles across a rugged obstacle course, the kind of terrain that separates people who talk about off-road recovery from people who actually do it for a living. It wasn't a beauty contest for builds, it was a pressure test, and everyone in that field knew it. Paul showed up with a brand new rig, just 96 miles on the engine, which either spoke to his confidence or his ambition, depending on how you looked at it. Bringing an untested machine to a competition that brutal was a gamble, and it showed. The Fab Rats rig had moments that impressed and moments that frustrated, including a widely noticed incident where their Isuzu Rodeo rolled during the competition with the driver still inside. The recovery of that situation drew sharp criticism from observers who felt Paul's decisions in the moment put someone at unnecessary risk. It was the kind of moment that gets replayed and dissected in forum threads for months afterward, and it was. Despite the controversy, Paul finished second overall and walked away from the closing ceremony with his chin up. He stood in front of the crowd, acknowledged the result, and made a promise. The truck would be dialed in, the lessons would be applied, and he'd be back the following year ready to go harder. It landed well. The crowd was into it. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of an annual tradition that would only get bigger. Matt, for his part, had built something that weekend that exceeded anything the off-road YouTube world had seen before. Fans flew in from other states. Vendors lined the grounds. The energy was undeniable. Everyone left Sand Hollow in March 2023 assuming they'd all be back together in 12 months. Only some of them were. While the record games looked like a high point from the outside, there were currents moving underneath the surface of Matt's channel that most casual viewers hadn't fully registered. Some of it had started years earlier, and not in a flattering way. Back in December 2021, Matt Wetzel was charged with insurance fraud. His lawyer framed it as a misunderstanding, someone trying to do the right thing but going about it the wrong way. Matt himself maintained it wasn't what it looked like. The court didn't fully agree. He was placed on probation and ordered to repay the insurance claim. It wasn't a case that ended his channel or tanked his audience in any significant way, but in a community built on trust and authenticity, it left a mark. People who had followed Matt for years because he felt like a straight shooter suddenly had to reckon with a version of the story that complicated that image. Some shrugged it off, others didn't forget. Around the same time, Matt began working with Daryl Eves, a YouTube consultant and VidSummit founder who happened to live just blocks away from Matt in Hurricane, Utah. Eves had helped scale some of the biggest channels on the platform and had a reputation for understanding the algorithm at a level most creators never reach. Matt's own account of how it started is telling. He'd been hearing Eves' name everywhere, cold called him on his cell phone, and essentially asked to be taught. Eves offered a $5,000 group course instead of one-on-one consulting. To Matt, at the time, that sounded like a ridiculous amount of money. He paid it anyway, and the channel was never quite the same after that, in terms of scale at least. What Eves helped Matt understand was the difference between documenting what you do and building content people actively seek out. The strategy worked. MORR's growth accelerated. Brand deals followed. A merchandise operation that Matt says now outperforms his actual towing business by a significant margin took shape. And then came the events, ticketed, large-scale, organized with the kind of infrastructure that grassroots YouTube channels don't typically have. The 2023 Record Games was the proof of concept. The 2024 Off-Road Games was supposed to be the expansion, but somewhere in that evolution from working-class recovery channel to multi-revenue media brand, the texture of what MIURR had been started to change, and not everyone who had been part of the original ecosystem was willing to follow it in that direction. Paul Cox was about to make that very clear. The 2024 Matt's Off-Road Games was supposed to be bigger than anything that came before it. New format, new scale, new faces. YouTubers from completely outside the off-road space were invited to compete alongside the established names. Ticket prices sat at $125 per person, and the whole operation had the feel of something that had outgrown its origins and was deliberately reaching for a different audience. For Matt, it represented the next logical step in building something larger than a YouTube channel. For a significant portion of the original community, it represented something else entirely. When the lineup started taking shape, the absences were impossible to ignore. Fab Rats wasn't attending. Neither was Merlin's Old School Garage. Casey Liddell pulled out. The core names that had made the 2023 Record Games feel like a genuine community event were gone, replaced by outside creators most off-road fans had never heard of. Forums and comment sections lit up almost immediately. Something had clearly shifted, and nobody on the inside was explaining what. Paul's official reason was straightforward enough on the surface: liability. He wasn't comfortable with strangers driving his vehicles as part of the competition format, and he'd already committed to heading to Glamis for a family gathering centered around his cousin Merlin's birthday and an old-school sandrail get-together. Taken at face value, it's a reasonable explanation. A custom-built rig with serious money and years of work behind it isn't something you hand to an unknown driver just because an event asks you to. Liability concerns in that context are legitimate, but the off-road community rarely takes things entirely at face value, and the conversations happening in forums and on Reddit pointed toward a different layer underneath the official explanation. The speculation that gained the most traction was financial, that Paul's wife, Michelle, who handles the business and production side of Fabby Rats, had pushed for a larger cut of the event's revenue in exchange for their appearance. Given that tickets were $125 a head and the event was drawing crowds willing to travel across the country, the financial stakes weren't small. If accurate, it would be a completely understandable position for any business to take, but it's also exactly the kind of conversation that leaves a bad taste when it doesn't get resolved. Neither side confirmed it. Neither side denied it. The silence around the whole situation was louder than anything either of them actually said publicly, and in a community that pays close attention, that silence told its own story. To understand the full picture, you have to go back to something that happened during the 2023 Record Games. Because while the event looked like a celebration of everything the off-road community had built together, it also produced a moment that followed Fab Rats out of Sand Hollow and never quite let go. During the competition, Paul's team was attempting a recovery involving an Isuzu Rodeo when the vehicle rolled onto its side with the driver still inside. In that kind of situation, the immediate priority is straightforward. Stop everything, assess the driver, make sure the person inside is safe before any equipment moves another inch. What happened instead drew sharp criticism from people watching both in person and in the footage that circulated afterward. Rather than halting the recovery and waiting for the driver to exit safely, Paul backed his rig into the roof of the rolled vehicle, the exact side where the driver was sitting, in an attempt to push it back upright. Then, with the rodeo still on its side, he pulled forward, which rolled it further onto its roof instead of righting it. The driver was fortunate to walk away without serious injury, but the margin for a very different outcome was uncomfortably thin, and the off-road community noticed. Forum threads dissected the footage at length. Observers who had spent years watching these channels, people who understood recovery work and the judgment calls it requires, were direct in their assessment. The consensus wasn't kind. For a channel built in part on the reputation of doing competent, skilled fabrication and recovery work, it was exactly the wrong kind of attention at exactly the wrong moment. What made it sting more was the context. The Record Games was supposed to be a showcase, the off-road YouTube world putting its best foot forward in front of a massive live audience and the cameras of every channel in the space. A safety incident of that nature, caught on film and analyzed, frame by thousands of viewers, doesn't just affect how people see that single moment. It affects how they recalibrate everything they thought they knew about the person involved. Whether that incident directly influenced Matt's perception of Paul or created distance in a relationship that was already beginning to stretch, is impossible to say with certainty. Neither man addressed it publicly between themselves, but in a community where reputation is currency and competence is the baseline expectation, moments like that leave a residue that doesn't wash off easily. Some things don't need to be said out loud to matter. By the time the dust settled around the 2024 game's walkaway, something had become clear that probably should have been obvious earlier. Fab Rats and Matt's off-road recovery were no longer moving in the same direction. They hadn't been for a while. The drift wasn't a single event or a single decision. It was the accumulated weight of two channels that had started in the same place and gradually found themselves building toward entirely different versions of what success looks like. Paul's answer to the question of what came next was telling. Rather than chasing the kind of large-scale event infrastructure that MoRR was building, Fab Rats leaned into something tighter and more controlled. Paul partnered with Chad's Fab for the ONX Off-Road Build Challenge, a competition format that kept the fabrication and off-road DNA intact, without the sprawling, ticketed spectacle that Matt's events had evolved into. It was a deliberate choice, whether Paul framed it that way publicly or not. The kind of collaboration he gravitated toward after stepping back from the MoRR orbit said a lot about where his priorities sat: family atmosphere, known quantities, work that speaks for itself without needing a $125 ticket and an outside consultant to package it. Matt's trajectory pointed the other direction entirely. The channel that started as one guy documenting tow jobs in southern Utah had become a multi-revenue operation with merchandise sales that outpaced the actual towing business, brand integrations, a content strategy built around algorithmic thinking, and events that draw crowds from across the country. None of that happened by accident, and none of it is illegitimate. Building something that's sustainable from a garage in Hurricane, Utah is genuinely impressive, but the version of more that exists now is almost unrecognizable compared to the channel that first built its audience on raw, unscripted recovery footage. The puzzle, as Matt himself calls it, got a lot more complicated when millions of dollars entered the equation. What's notable is that neither Paul nor Matt has ever said a negative word about the other publicly. No call-out videos, no pointed comments, no vague social media posts that the community had to decode. Just two channels that used to show up constantly in each other's content, quietly going their separate ways without feeling the need to explain it to anyone. That restraint is either genuine mutual respect between two people who built something real together, or it's the most disciplined PR move in off-road YouTube history. Probably somewhere in between. Here's the thing about a story with no villain. It's harder to wrap up neatly, but it's usually closer to the truth. Nothing in the Fab Rats and MoRR drift points to one person being wrong and the other being right. Paul Cox built something authentic and chose to protect it when the direction around him stopped feeling like his. Matt Wetzel built something that kept growing and made the decisions that growth required, even when those decisions changed the texture of what the channel had originally been. Two reasonable responses to the same pressure, two different outcomes. What got lost in the middle was something the off-road community genuinely valued: that era of effortless collaboration between channels that felt like neighbors rather than brands. The joint recoveries, the trail runs, the kind of cross-channel chemistry that can't be scheduled into a content calendar or optimized by a consultant. Whether Paul and Matt ever find their way back to each other's orbit is anyone's guess. Neither of them is talking. Both of them are still building. But the audience remembers what it looked like when they were building together, and that version of things was worth more than either of them probably realized at the time.